I'll trust was positive.
Yeah,
and thank you, everyone.
A word of it, so.
And thanks, everyone, for coming. For those of you, well, both here and also maybe watching the live stream, not only are we from Los Angeles, and so we did not pack accordingly, but it's an unusually cold week, or maybe unusually cold month in Moscow. So if we look like we're trembling, I'm sure some of it is nerves, but most of it is that it's unspeakably cold up here. So anyway, with that, let me put my tea down. So as Olga mentioned, and as the slide behind you indicates, we're here to talk about the topic of quarantine. Quarantine is something that we've been researching for many, many years now, and that we are finishing up a book that should be out at some point next year, we hope, both in the US and UK, and maybe even in Russia, if we can find a translator and press. And we wanted to present quarantine to you tonight, both in terms of its overall interest and relevance to fields of architecture and design, but also our own individual approaches to the topic, and to explain how we came to it individually, and maybe, hopefully instill in you an interest in the topic of quarantine. So for me, as a writer with a background mostly covering architecture, design, cities, and technology, quarantine has stood out to me as a particularly interesting topic, precisely because at its heart, it's a spatial question. The notion of quarantine is that A needs to be kept spatially separate from B, so that you can prevent contamination, infection, or other influence between those two things. So at its heart, quarantine is a very simple instruction or an algorithm or a kind of spatial agenda that says two things cannot be in the same place at the same time. They have to be in different buildings, or they have to be in different rooms. And what's interesting for me about that is that it has effects on multiple scales. So on the level of a room, if something is in quarantine, you need to start introducing particularly either walls or very advanced air handling. On the scale of a building, you need to start thinking about circulation, how people might move through that building without passing one another, without coming into contact with one another. On the scale of a city, you start thinking about how entire neighborhoods need to be kept separate. You might need to shut down bridges so that there's not movement between two neighborhoods. You might need to build something like the Berlin Wall, for that matter, which is kind of a metaphoric political quarantine, to keep neighborhoods separate. And then, of course, as you continue up the scales, and as you start looking at more immaterial notions of quarantine, you get into the political implications. You get into restrictions of movement. You get into how individual subjects of a government are defined, the rights that they might have, and then particularly, at least for us in a United States context, you also get into constitutional implications. Who has the right of movement? Who has the right of due process? Is it possible to argue against quarantine in a court of law, despite its medical nature? And then, of course, you also get into metaphoric or literary implications. Very briefly, this is quite a large topic, but you'll start finding quarantine everywhere when you're really looking for it. Everywhere from, there's a fantastic short story called The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe, who was a kind of proto-science fiction detective novelist or writer from the United States. The Decameron, the kind of classic of European literature, is a quarantine story. And then, of course, you see it throughout contemporary horror, where you can even just simply call a movie Quarantine, as a recent American film did, and the very nature of quarantine is meant to be so terrifying that you know immediately it's a horror film because it's about quarantine and the forced separation or isolation that the plot will be about. And then, as I forget here in the cold to advance through the slide deck, sorry. These are just images of the architectural nature of quarantine here on various islands throughout the Mediterranean. Quarantine, of course, also then takes place on the very edges of things, where quarantine stations are on the edges of the city, on the edges of the nation state. They're far away. They're meant to keep things as spatially separate as we can. One of the things that we'll talk about tonight is that quarantine, in fact, is an edge that's being enveloped into the center. The thing that we used to perform at the periphery is now becoming a very fundamental and literally spatial, a literally central task. But I wanted to just end this opening look at the kind of meanings of quarantine with a great reference here, which is that sometimes our most foundational mythologies of our civilizations and our cultures can also be boiled down to quarantine. There's a really, really interesting story called Alexander's Gates, varieties of which have passed down through different cultures. And a variation of this is even in the Quran. But the notion was that Alexander the Great, the Macedonian conqueror, was allegedly responsible for building these huge iron gates in the Caucasus mountain range that would act as a literal line of separation between the West and the East. That the world of the Eastern monstrous would be kept at bay behind these locked doors in the mountains, and that Alexander's Gates would act as a kind of quarantine line until it was safe for the two cultures to meet or to interact. And thus, sort of in the mythological heart of how we define the West, how we defined Europe or the Western experience, is a kind of quarantine demarcation. And I think that's an indication of just how huge the scale can get in terms of how we discuss quarantine and where it occurs.
So Geoff was the one of us that was originally interested in quarantine, and he mentioned this to me when we were actually in Australia. And Australia is very, very big on quarantine, so we started seeing it everywhere. He's talking about it, the Australians are really into it. I start thinking, well, maybe this quarantine thing is quite interesting. And the reason I became very interested in it is a little bit different from why Geoff is interested in it, although we've now sort of overlapped and met somewhere in the middle. But the thing that I initially found so fascinating about quarantine is, by definition, it's unclear whether a person in quarantine is infected or not. So if you're known to be sick and you're known to be contagious, then you are going to be isolated. You're not put in quarantine, you're isolated. So to be eligible for quarantine, you just simply have to be suspected of being a danger to others. And that makes it a very sort of legally and morally unusual tool. You know, an individual can be considered and treated essentially as guilty until they're proven innocent. So that kind of inherent slipperiness and potential for abuse, obviously, immediately fascinated me. And I started thinking, well, this quarantine, seen from the public health perspective, is a framework for coping with risk. But it's also a way of legitimizing suspicion. It's a way of sort of manipulating time and space to create a buffer against uncertainty. But you also get to suspend the usual rules of engagement and do things a little differently. So it has that going for it. You can, for example, just simply quarantine an individual. A nurse who treated Ebola patients, you deprive her of her civil liberties for the common good. But you could also quarantine an entire class of people. So, for example, all the mostly poor, mostly young, supposedly promiscuous women who were had their movement and their freedom restricted by police-enforced quarantine under something that wonderfully is called the American Plan in the 19-teens and 1920s. The idea was to prevent the spread of venereal disease. What this actually was quarantine as legalized social control of female sexuality. You could also, while you're quarantining an entire group of people, take the case of the Haitian refugees quarantined at Guantanamo in the 1990s by then and current Attorney General William Barr. They were suspected, he said, of being HIV positive. In the end, very, 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 very few of them were. But this was this sort of ethical and legal and, of course, a Guantanamo geographical state of exception that sort of this example, many legal scholars say, paved the way for then in the 2000s, enemy combatants, which is another sort of exception to the usual rules. So you can also quarantine an entire nation. So again, we're in Cuba, and JFK quarantined in Cuba during the missile crisis. And this, again, it comes back to that idea of sort of suspending the usual rules by calling it what was essentially a naval blockade, by calling it a quarantine. he wasn't committing an act of war and didn't have to declare war. So you can see, I started to see that the way that quarantine had this kind of slipperiness to it that would be worth kind of jumping in, and we started writing a book together.
And on nights like tonight, it feels less like a joke, but we've been joking that Nicola is also writing another book because, why only write one at the same time? But that one's a history and future of refrigeration. And to help out with that, I've been tagging along, and we've been going into refrigerated warehouses all over the world, really.
Extremely glamorous locations.
And as someone who gets extremely cold, we've been joking that the next book needs to be chosen based on where the research will take you. And so we've been joking then as well that if you're thinking of taking on a large research project, consider writing a history of saunas or of the beach.
Tropical vacations.
Yeah. But in this case, one of the great things about quarantine is that the research trips allowed us to go to really, really phenomenal landscapes that were also tax deductions, which at least in the US context is quite extraordinary. But so quarantine's history really kind of ties it back to the Mediterranean and the Adriatic Seas in particular. It really kind of, it more or less was invented in what is now Croatia, and then blossomed throughout the Adriatic and eventually throughout the Mediterranean and also, of course, the terrestrial Europe and the Middle East. But we were able to spend a lot of time in these really phenomenal locations, visiting ruined quarantine hospitals, derelict medical facilities, castles, forts, other kinds of peripheral architectural structures that had been either purpose-built for quarantine or reused for quarantine. And so this here is a small island off the coast of Dubrovnik in Croatia. And I wanted to just give a couple examples from our travels. This is the first. What's interesting or what I want to try to describe are the ways in which larger factors lead to quarantine being implemented as a local strategy of spatial control. And so in the case of what is now Croatia, one of the reasons why quarantine was as necessary there was that maritime trade was coming up the Adriatic, coming out of the Middle East, or going, for that matter, going to the Middle East. But prevailing winds, as well as obviously larger economic forces, but prevailing winds would keep a lot of these ships and thus a lot of the maritime trade and the goods, and also a lot of the shipborne diseases on the east side of the Adriatic, which had the effect that they had to implement some way to slow down the arrival of these things coming in over the sea, to delay entry, to hit pause, and that was quarantine. And so the landscape itself also lent itself to this purpose where you could transform peninsulas and islands into kind of waiting stations, or you could force ships to anchor out at sea and wait and fly the quarantine flag. And basically you're introducing time and space, you're introducing a buffer, you're introducing a delay into the arrival of something to us, to the thing that you're trying to protect. And in Dubrovnik's case, it was a meteorological phenomenon that helped dictate local spatial control. The other place very strongly associated with quarantine is Venice, the city of Venice. Venice is kind of where quarantine was perfected as basically a design science. Venice lends itself extremely well to quarantine. And then that'd be the second thing I want to mention, which is that the actual topography of the city is very easy to break off and isolate and shut down movement. So, for example, it's a city of islands, lagoons, peninsulas. It's very easy to just close down one bridge from an island to the next, or to not let ferry traffic or gondola traffic go from one island to the other. You can just build a wall to seal off an island and go from an actual topographic island to an architectural one. But the geography of the city itself lends itself well to these incisions, delays, and interruptions. And it's also then no coincidence that Venice is the origin of the modern ghetto. When we use the word ghetto, when we talk about ghettoization, it comes back to the Jewish ghetto that was created in Venice through simple architectural means: barricades, blockades, closed bridges. It's a architectural language of doors and blockages that allows quarantine to be realized. And then the next location I just wanted to mention in terms of these larger settings, we've had a meteorological phenomenon. We've got the topography of the city. In this case, we've got the actual location of the nation island itself. This is Malta. Again, this is maybe, even though this is, you're seeing this through an Instagram filter, it is nevertheless a very beautiful place. And this was the kind of thing that we got to do with research, was climbing over fences with the architect who was working on a renovation of this place to go explore it at sunset, which is just a pretty extraordinary thing to be doing. But Malta is not only a fascinating country from an architectural point of view, or if you're into subterranean exploration, but from a quarantine point of view, it's in a really interesting location in that it's at a bottleneck between North Africa and Southern Europe. And so marine traffic that's coming out of the Middle East, or for that matter, down the Adriatic and into Western Europe, into ports in France, Spain, Portugal, England, and so on, goes near enough to Malta that imperial powers came to an agreement, which was that they could outsource their border to the Maltese. And so something coming to London would have to stop in Malta and perform quarantine there. But that was an agreement with the British government, or with the British Empire, that they could effectively outsource their border, setting a precedent for a lot of interesting immigration and refugee and asylum arguments that we're now finding again today, that basically have a lot of their rhetorical origins in the quarantine agreements of the imperial years. And so, excuse me, so for example, you can go through customs to fly to the United States while you're still in the airport in Ireland. Australia is going through some really strange border arguments about whether or not they do in fact own certain islands, and whether or not they're trying to push those islands away so that refugees who set foot on them aren't technically speaking in Australia. But you can trace a lot of this kind of spatial logic of sovereignty back to the quarantine trade, I guess you could say. As well as just briefly, I want to highlight this photograph just because I love the path of human movement that has been etched through the vegetation here. Just kind of showing how the traces of the people who have been kept inside these facilities and who continue to visit them as new tourist sites also leave their own traces that we try to explore in the book as well.
So we didn't just visit fabulous places. We also spoke to a lot of extremely interesting people who make quarantine their business, like obscure but fascinating experts. So there is the United States Planetary Protection Officer. This is one woman who has a tiny little office in Washington, D.C., and is in charge of quarantining Earth from the rest of the universe and vice versa. So what that means, practically speaking, is a thing called forward contamination, which is where we would take our own life with us into space, microbes mainly, and then get really excited that we found life on Mars when actually we just brought it with us. That is one kind of quarantine that she is in charge of overseeing. And then the other kind of quarantine is back contamination, which is when we would bring scary alien microbes, if they exist, back to Earth, and they would cause a scary alien plague. And it was for that reason, for example, that the Apollo astronauts, when they landed back on Earth, didn't immediately go and have their ticker tape parade, but instead had to get into these biological isolation garments and then be taken and spend time in quarantine in a little converted Airstream trailer. It's very chic. And while NASA figured out if the dust that they had brought back with them was safe and whether they got sick or not. This is still a relevant issue today as we start to think about bringing back samples from Mars. So there's a large amount of thinking and work that goes on at NASA thinking about how do we safely bring something back from Mars. And the interesting challenge here is it's not just, often Geoff was saying you have to think about air pressure a lot when you're thinking about designing a clean room. So you don't want, for the case of quarantine, you have negative air pressure situations. So you have lower air pressure in the room, higher air pressure outside. It means nothing escapes from the room. But for bringing back a Martian sample, we not only do we not want anything to escape the room, we don't want anything from Earth to come in. So it's sort of a double quarantine situation, which is what that 3-wall configuration is all about. At one point, NASA decided that just keeping the samples off Earth was going to be the easiest way to quarantine them, but has not proved to be the case. So in any case, she's one of the experts we spoke to, as well as her European counterpart. We spoke to a retired guy in North London who runs something called the Disinfected Male Study Circle. This is a group that, in a supremely nerdy way, traces the history of quarantines, cordon sanitaire, health passports, all these kinds of health-related restrictions on movement using postal ephemera. So until surprisingly recently, the late 1800s in some places, there was a belief that infectious diseases could be transmitted by paper, and so mail was routinely punctured or opened and then disinfected, quotes, using smoke or vinegar or perfume or whatever was thought to be effective at the time, and then resealed with these special wafers or stamps. And those traces, the puncture marks, the vinegar stains, the wax seals, they allow this group to sort of reconstruct the otherwise kind of patchy history of who was banned from traveling where the plague was at any given moment, where people believed the plague was at any given moment. So that's that group. And then another fascinating person we met with, and this is looking towards the future of quarantine, is a data scientist working with Facebook and Twitter and Google to understand social mixing patterns and create predictive models of disease transmission. So this picture shows, based on his real-time sort of contact modeling, how a disease that patient 0 was in the attractive Surrey town of Hazelmere, how fast and where it would spread in the UK without any quarantine and with control measures, including school closures, but also things like quarantine. But this kind of work that he's doing leads to something that we've been calling anticipatory quarantine, which is this idea that with sufficient data and sort of sufficiently advanced algorithms, are we going to be able to sort of restrict your movement before exposure happens so that we don't have to restrict your movement after exposure happens? And what are the downsides of that?
Yeah, and so along those lines, what we've been looking at are the encroachment of data companies into the quarantine space. It's become a cliche, I think, in the digital economy to try to be the Uber of something. So, you can be the Uber of grocery delivery or the Uber of Uber, for that matter. Who will disrupt Uber? Or who's going to be the Uber of quarantine? So you see people that are genuinely interested in figuring out ways to perfect the idea of quarantine, to implement it earlier, and to find ways to be more efficient about who goes into quarantine and who doesn't get swept up into it. So one of the things that's really interesting is watching the discourse that surrounds Google flu trends and ways of extrapolating from what you're looking at online to whether or not you might be sick. And so the idea would be that if everyone in Brooklyn or everyone here at Strelka begins Googling certain terms about maybe discount tissues or flu medication or symptoms of a particular disease, you might be able to, and the might here is not me claiming that, but data companies claim that you might be able to extrapolate from that the idea that a sickness is spreading. And so if you know who's doing it, then you know who should be quarantined. So the dystopian scenario that that has arisen while reporting this book is that if you look at, for example, Nest, the home smart home system that controls thermostats but also door locks, is owned by Google. Google has access to your search history and might decide that you're sick. Google decides that you need to be quarantined. Google no longer lets your Nest open up the front door because it automatically locks, and you no longer have medical control over your own ability to exit your house. And you've been quarantined by a smart home. So while that scenario is not, to my knowledge, existing in the present moment, it seems only a matter of time before that type of thing arises, where the smart home becomes almost like a medical weapon against people in the name of quarantine and in the name of restricting movement. So in any case, that future I think is actually coming closer, or rather is closer than we think. While we were reporting this, we almost accidentally actually met someone at a quarantine conference who had been working with a major international extraction firm on an island off the coast of Australia. If you're familiar with Australia, you'll know that they take quarantine very, very seriously there. It's a quarantine-forward nation, one might say. But it's very easy for species to take hold in Australia, as rabbits and all kinds of invasive plants have already shown. And so the Australians want to keep invasive species out. There are metaphors for political parties in that as well. In any case, this island, the agreement between Australia and this extraction firm for their ability to take advantage of the resources on this island was that they could introduce no invasive species at all. So they rose to the challenge. Allegedly, according to their own self-reporting, they have been successful. They have introduced no invasive species. But the way in which they did it was by...
It's not just self-reporting. It was an academic study.
Okay.
But
sure.
I mean, we don't have to trust anything oil companies say, but...
Yeah, okay. It wasn't only self-reported. Excuse me. But the way in which they did this was by unleashing this kind of army of machine sensing, artificial intelligence, and robotic vehicles that were scouring the landscape for invasive species and other unexpected biological matter. And so, in a way that may or may not actually touch on some of the themes that we'll talk about tomorrow night, if you want to come back in warmer clothing, and we're going to be discussing machine vision, laser scanning, and the future of that type of machine representations of landscapes. But what they've been doing is looking at every single piece of cargo and every single piece of equipment that comes out onto the islands and filtering it through machine learning packages and trying to spot things without human intervention. So the idea then is that this fully automatic, robotized quarantine island is already a reality, and you can imagine that easily being sent out to be used politically in Beijing Airport or Moscow Airport or New York City JFK, an entirely uncrewed quarantine facility is here and real. Just very briefly, I think it's hilarious that one of the ways they did the training was they invented a new game called Quarantine Hero. It was inspired by Guitar Hero. And the idea was that they would flash little animated models of cargo, like backpacks for travelers, actual cargo containers, individual pieces of equipment, and it was a simulated quarantine training scenario. And you could actually, move up or down the leaderboard, so you could be a true hero of quarantine. It's worth pointing out that already some of their techniques have been exported to Antarctica for controlling some of the goods that are shipped down to research stations in the Antarctic. And so again, we're seeing a kind of quarantine creep as it leaches out into everyday life.
So these are some of the places and people that we talk about and topics that we talk about in the book. But what we thought we would do tonight is, rather than kind of give the overview of the whole book, is dive in and give you a glimpse of our final reporting trip for the book, which was to the American Midwest. We went to Omaha. Well, first we went to Omaha, Nebraska, which is pretty much in the middle of the country. And the reason we went there is that it is the site of the first federal quarantine facility in the US for nearly a century. So that's that vaguely hideous building on the top left there. And so at the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, the US had like every other nation, the US had quarantine hospitals at its edges, as Geoff said. You would detain immigrants suspected of carrying disease on islands in New York Harbor and in San Francisco Bay before they ever reached the mainland. Those fell out of use, they're now ruins, and in some ways the same kind of fate befell quarantine for a long time as the 20th century progressed, and we had vaccines and we had antibiotics and we had cures. It began to seem as if infectious disease was going to be defeated. We were going to conquer contagion, and quarantine was just this old-fashioned instrument, blunt, from a time before the wonders of modern medicine, and maybe no longer necessary. And you still find people, doctors today who are like, oh, quarantine is so old-fashioned. But then the 21st century happened, and there was, first of all, 9/11 fueling fears of bioterrorism. The first time people really started to take that seriously with the anthrax in the mail subsequently. And then 2003 with SARS. So now you have a sort of novel disease traveling around the globe in days, and you have doctors refusing to treat people that they think might have been exposed to the disease, and you have hospitals refusing to take patients that they think might have been exposed to the disease, refusing to take patients from entire ethnic groups that they think might have been exposed to the disease. And suddenly quarantine starts to be a major logistical problem again. There's no place to put people. And so now, in the 21st century, it now seems like a global pandemic is sort of a case of not if, but when. And so the governments are once again starting to take quarantine seriously. And so the US government realized it had no good answer to the question of where to put people in quarantine, people who might have been exposed to an infectious disease, a place where they could be comfortable and cared for, but also not be a danger to others. And so they gave the University of Nebraska Medical Center $20 million to build a 20-bed quarantine facility in Omaha. Actually, the university was already building a building when this grant came through, and they just retrofitted the lower level that was going to be parking and turned it into a quarantine facility. So we went, it's opening in September, we went in May and got a sneak peek, and one of the things that's interesting is it's in Omaha, it's no longer in New York City or San Francisco. There are reasons for that. It looks like a mid-range hotel. It's sort of, there are, ensuite bathrooms, high-speed Wi-Fi, flat-screen TVs, neutral paint job. It looks very, very normal. And then you see that there are some important differences. But for us, it was a sort of interesting reminder that, quarantine in some ways has an uncanny resemblance to normal American life. You are mostly alone in a room. You do your interacting online. You binge watch Netflix, and when you do exercise, it's on a run in place on a treadmill. And all of those things are the key features of quarantine. So in some ways, it's sort of a sort of more extreme, more boring version of everyday life. But there are some important differences. So, for example, there at the bottom left, you see the air controls. Each room can be isolated. So if someone does show symptoms of disease, you can now actually turn a quarantine room into an isolation room. And you'll see they just had this out, the plan. The waste handling and air handling for this quarantine facility is a lot more sophisticated than you would find at the Holiday Inn. So it's sort of these incredible engineering controls. The walls, for example, are painted with this substance called glow germ, so that if you miss any bacteria while you're cleaning, it shows up under UV light. So under the surface of this sort of anonymous hotel look is this extraordinary engineering effort. And this section of the book is where we sort of dive into this idea of the experience of quarantine, and the idea that at least the US version is this bizarre combination of, yes, boredom, but also existential dread, because at any time you might have the terrible disease that you are being monitored for. And then this is the reason that the quarantine facility is in Omaha, because Omaha happens to have the largest biocontainment facility in the US, 10 beds of, Ebola care facility, essentially. And so, as sort of Geoff hinted at the beginning, the border is now a much more technological concept. So rather than sort of stopping people at the doorstep of America, you can bring them to the quarantine unit, and then if they become sick, transport them to the biocontainment unit, and they will never have sort of physically left their bubble of air. You know, they bring their exterior with them into the interior of the country. So we took a tour of this biocontainment unit as well. These are the nurses that work there. That's a mannequin, obviously. And biocontainment and quarantine both, they present really interesting design challenges. So you have to account for every particle of air, every scrap of clothing, waste material, every surface. All of it has to be thought through. You're thinking about air handling, waste sterilization, disposal, surface materials that could be cleaned, security to prevent unauthorized access, but also to prevent escape. And then the direction of staff and patient movement. Geoff was talking about directionality. You always have to go from clean to dirty and never the other way around. It's a strange way to sort of design and think about space. And these two nurses have cared for several Ebola patients there. I was saying the patients, they only have a video phone link to the outside world. Even if they're dying, that's it. That's their only link to their loved ones. And actually, they did have an Ebola patient who died, and the wife of the man who died asked if the nurses would perform last rites, because a priest can't come in to perform last rites. So they had to Google how to perform last rites on the man over a video phone link, and then they sealed him up in this special material that they have, and heat sealed the edges. That's him demonstrating that, and shipped him off for specialized disposal. But it's like, that's the level of detail we're looking at. The other thing on the right there is, because you only ever go in one direction through this space, from clean to dirty, the doors only have handles on one side, because they don't, you can't go the other way. So yeah, this is Geoff, actually, on the left there, in full isolation gear, personal protective equipment. And on his left, your right, is a quarantine historian wearing the sort of medieval Black Death equivalent. What's kind of fun is that it's the same idea, different technology. The beak on those traditional plague doctor costumes is filled with, sweet-smelling herbs, with the idea that it will sort of shield you from the disease. But so what's interesting about this is it points to a sort of split in quarantine design philosophy. So in the US, they have these very highly engineered spaces with the negative air pressure and the security and the waste handling and all of that. And then within that, the healthcare workers all wear this gear. So they're in their own sort of little bubble inside that. And the patient is relatively free to move. The patient is being sort of, not quarantined outside of that. In the UK, there's a very different philosophy around this. And it sort of works the other way around. The UK has something called the Trexler Unit, which is a special polythene plastic patient isolator invented in the 1970s. And it's basically like a giant plastic bag around the bed. There's a lower air pressure inside the bag. And then they have, can't really see them here. It's probably easier to see here. They have, this is me inside it. They have sort of half suits built into the wall so that medical professionals can literally sort of insert themselves into the wall around the patient. There's also whole portals for wires and tubes. There's a little add-on unit at the end that you use for passing food in and passing waste out. And it's just interesting to see these two very different design solutions to isolation that then have a very distinct impact on the experience. So in Nebraska, the patients are being treated by people dressed up in the full gear. You can only see their eyes. You can't see the rest of their faces. That's a little terrifying. For the healthcare workers, it's very awkward, it's hot, it's heavy. It's also actually more dangerous. Most infections are caused when you're taking off the gear and putting on the gear. So more infections are caused in America than in the UK. But on the other hand, the patient can get up if they're well enough, move around. They aren't trapped in their own little bubble. Also in America, only the trained infectious disease specialists can come into the space. So even if you need a consultation from other medical doctors, they do it over the video link because they're not trained to put on the full protective gear. In the UK version, you have your patient in a bubble, which is weird for the patient. They can't get out of bed. They're trapped in a plastic bag over the bed. But their doctors and nurses don't have to be wearing the full kind of hazmat gear. And any doctor or nurse can come in, family members could come in and be on the other side of that bubble. So it's a sort of interesting difference in a design solution to quarantine that got us thinking about sort of the cultural differences of quarantine. And that just sort of brings me to a very quick story, which was while we were in Nebraska, we met a doctor who had been quarantined there. He'd been working in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He'd accidentally not had gloves on when he was first examining a woman who then went on to die from Ebola. And so the US evacuated him to Nebraska to wait in quarantine and see if he developed the disease. This is him saying goodbye to his family. They had to stay 9 foot apart from him, and so this is their sort of hug before he was taken away. And if he had Ebola and if he had died, this is the last time they would have even been this close to him. So it's kind of it looks funny, but it's also incredibly sort of poignant moment. He was medevaced. He was taken to the biocontainment unit. He didn't develop Ebola, and he actually was like, I'm a bit of an introvert, so this is very relaxing for me to have all this time alone. There was a treadmill in there. He was like, I got in great shape in quarantine. So he was saying for him it was actually quite a pleasant experience, but with this underlying sense of, am I going to develop the disease? But his speculation to us was that, the very thing that makes Americans resistant to quarantine, this idea that you're taking away our freedom and our civil liberties and you're telling us we can't move, actually makes Americans quite suited to quarantine because it's a very individualistic culture. And what he had found as a doctor in the Congo is this huge resistance to quarantine. This is an Ebola center that had been burned down. And he put us in touch with some of his colleagues in the Democratic Republic of Congo that we've been talking to. And they have been telling us that their patients fear quarantine and isolation more than Ebola itself, i.e. living on your own and outside of the community is actually a fate worse than death, so better to have the disease. In fact, if you are isolated and alone and away from your family, you are more likely to develop the disease. You'll get Ebola because you are so vulnerable. The other interesting thing about this particular situation is not just a sort of cultural belief, but this particular region does not trust the authorities, as many of you will have read. And so a lot of people just believe that people are being taken away and given Ebola. So what that pointed to was this sort of idea of the need for transparency and trust, and how much do people understand of the system they're being put in. And I was just going to tell a Casey Hickox story. Yeah. Okay. Because the other thing that was going on in Omaha while we were there was all the nation's judges, the supreme courts of every individual state, those judges had come to Omaha to talk about what to do in a pandemic. And so these are the people literally who are going to be in charge of enforcing and mandating quarantine. But most of them have never done it, and they have no idea how to do it or even when they would do it and if they can do it and how they would go about it. And so this conference was a chance for them to figure it out. And one of the presentations was about someone you might have heard about, Casey Hickox, the so-called Ebola nurse. She was nursing in Sierra Leone. She came back. She had not necessarily been exposed particularly, but she was coming from that region. And the then governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, decided that he would isolate her in a tent in an abandoned hospital building with no washing facilities and only a porta potty. And she was like, well, this is ridiculous. He let her go after 3 days. She went back to Maine, which is the state she was from. And there, the state, she was about to, she's coming home after being in Sierra Leone. She was about to go out to a bar that evening, meet up with her friends, and have a welcome home drink. And the governor of Maine at the time did not think that was a great idea. There was a lot of public fear about Ebola, and was she going to spread Ebola, and she must not be allowed to spread Ebola. And so the governor called a judge and said, order her into quarantine. And the judge had no idea what to do. I mean, he's never done this. So he issued something called a status quo order, which just bought him enough time to keep her in that night. But immediately realized there were all sorts of problems. She was in this tiny town. There was no way of reaching her. The marshal decided he didn't want to go and deliver the papers because he might be exposed to Ebola. The judge is looking up the relevant case law. The last time quarantine had been, the statutes had been used was in 1919 after World War I with the flu. So he's like, he couldn't even tell who had the burden of proof of showing that she should be in quarantine. Was it the state, or was it on her to prove that she shouldn't be in quarantine? So next day, he's out of time. He has to make a decision, and he decided he couldn't order a quarantine. What he did do, though, that was quite interesting, is that he ordered her to cooperate with monitoring, and he ordered her to only travel within the state, the limited travel. And he said this, he said this frankly to us, but he said it at the time, too, to her. There may be no rational reason for this, but there's another disease, another contagion that spreads that is as dangerous as Ebola, and that is fear. And if people are afraid, I have to respect that, and you have to respect that too. And what I thought was interesting, and Casey Hickox went along with that, there was some degree of her freedoms that she was willing to give up to sort of allow that gesture towards public confidence, a sense of safety. And there were two things I thought were interesting. One is that, these quarantine decisions will be made in an atmosphere of fear and panic, and some allowance will inevitably be made towards that, and what should it be? And the second piece was that, you ideally want to make these decisions before, or have had these conversations before you have to make these decisions. So a situation where you're looking up the case law, the last ruling is from 1919 and you don't know what to do, is not ideal when it could be a life or death situation and you don't have time to think about the nuance of this. So one of the things there's Chris Christie, can't resist. One of the things we've been doing for this book is going to a lot of exercises. This was the sort of simulation that the judges were running. This was the simulation that we went to that was being run in DC with a lot of current and former government officials and senators and so on. And there are two interesting things. One, no one has thought through what we're going to do. But two, we think, and this is part of why we're writing the book, is that it shouldn't just be government officials and judges and medical professionals having these conversations. This is an incredibly powerful tool that will be used, and we should all have thought through what impingements on individual liberties we're willing to accept for the public good ahead of time. So that's part of why the book sort of, needs to happen now.
And so, so as Nicola's mentioned a couple times, there are many, many themes and other examples in the book, and we don't want to give all of them this evening, obviously. So one of the chapters that I'll just spend just sort of a brief kind of final look at now is it looks at quarantine for species other than human. And so what's interesting, obviously, is that if you're talking about diseases and pandemics, human beings very obviously are not the only ones who get it. We've already talked about many diseases like SARS and Ebola that are known as a zoonosis. That means it comes from the animal world. It's infective for humans, and then we can pass it from human to human. But then obviously plants also are subject to disease, and these two things together might sound relatively low stakes. You can see these kinds of quarantine stations even when you fly into the Moscow airport. There's a plant quarantine station when you go through customs. And when you drive from Nevada into the state of California, where we live, there's an inspection station where they look into your car to see if you have fruits and vegetables. It doesn't seem like there's very much at stake there, but in reality, there's some very existential threats lurking in the world of plant and animal quarantine. And so briefly, these are just some photographs of quarantine inspections. And but as novels like this, The Death of Grass, show, and obviously this is just a novel, but the premise of this novel is that a wheat rust, which is a particular kind of disease that infects wheat and all grasses. Wheat is a grass, corn is a grass, maize is a grass.
Rice is a grass.
Rice is a grass. And so if a sufficiently unstoppable rust or blast is another, were to be unleashed on the world, it could actually wipe out a very large percentage of the human food supply, leading to mass starvation and the collapse of governments. And that's one of the things that's actually being studied now in the quarantine and plant safety community, including what I'm getting to shortly. This entire FBI, and in this case, USDA reports on agro-terrorism and the risk of this being launched. One of the people we interviewed for the book was a retired US general who was with a team, or rather was supervising a team, who found a handwritten list in Afghanistan in 2003 that was listing plant and animal pathogens with the obvious implication that Al-Qaeda was looking into the weaponization of plant and animal diseases to try to wipe out the global food supply as the kind of ultimate act of jihad. And so thankfully there are people trying to prevent that from happening. But what we've been talking about all night is this idea that the quarantine that can happen on the edges, and that usually does, is being centralized. It's being absorbed into the middle. The other place that we went was just down the road from Omaha in the state of Kansas. It's very nearly in the exact heart of the country, and it's also in the heart of American agriculture. Kansas is synonymous with farming. And what's happening in Kansas is that in this little town called Manhattan, they are relocating what you see on the screen now, which is the Plum Island Animal Disease Center. This is currently located on an island off the coast of Long Island, just outside New York City. And so what they're doing is they're taking a research facility that is on the edges of things and not particularly close to widespread agriculture, and they're putting it in the heart of the American food supply, and they're bringing all the plant and animal diseases near the livestock and the wheat fields and the corn. And so this is not without controversy. But what just a few things that I'll mention before wrapping up, just in the interest of time, that are interesting here are that the condition of an island that was being met by a literal island, in the case of Plum Island off of New York City, is now being met through architectural systems. And so you can create an island architecturally through advanced air handling. In this case, it's an air handling system that's so advanced it can actually work in tandem with a major tornado happening outside the building. So if a tornado were to strike the building, the internal air would maintain the same pressure. So these incredible acts of architectural engineering in the name of isolation and quarantine are underway in order to bring this facility there. There's many examples I wanted to give, but I think the two I'll give just before wrapping up one thing was very interesting, that we learned that local communities are obviously quite concerned about what might happen if there is a leakage or an outbreak, or a tornado actually knocks the building down and all the pathogens fly out. And so there are plans to try to mitigate the effects of that. And so there was even one sheriff that we heard of who's developed a kind of quarantine plan for his town. He knows exactly what roads to close, which roads to drop concrete barriers on, and basically shut off the town from road traffic, and to try to prevent other, like infected livestock on a truck from coming through and bringing the pathogen into the town itself. But it raises, well, first of all, it sounds like something out of a horror novel, where you've got a local sheriff shutting down his entire town through concrete blocks and quarantining it. But it also raises the prospect again of urban design and the idea of towns surrounding facilities like these that are built from the very beginning in order to be more easily quarantinable. You can imagine an entire field of urban design and architecture coming out of these kinds of heartlands and these kinds of scenarios. And then finally, I just want to mention one thing, which was that in order to review the security of this facility, they also hired a team of former Navy SEALs to come through and look for vulnerabilities and blind spots. I was thinking rather that the only reason they were doing that is out of fear of a terrorist attack, a disgruntled farmer ramming the building with a truck. But it turned out actually that the suspicion that they were looking at actually went both ways. So it wasn't only to protect the facility from the outside world, but it was that they were afraid that local farmers might try to stage a kind of false infection based on the location of certain vents and ducts that the Navy SEALs had found on the outside. And they recommended redesigning the perimeter wall of the building in order to take away those potential moments of being framed for unleashing an infection that wasn't in fact the responsibility of the Animal Disease Research Center. And so I just mentioned that because I think it's an interesting example of how the trust that we've been talking about, the ability to trust an authority who says that you must stay at home, we're quarantining you, that you believe what they're saying, that like the Ebola example that Nikki gave, where what if you don't even believe the disease is real? What if you don't trust the government who is doing that because maybe you're a political dissident, or maybe you voted for the party that's not currently in power? If you don't trust the people who are enlisting quarantine or asking you to go into quarantine, enormous stakes, or public health itself is at stake. And so those lines of communication, trust, and the ability to understand where one another is coming from in this kind of dialogue of quarantine is something that I think is unbelievably important when it comes to this. And also I think just very quickly, as a kind of end note, I'd say that it's very easy to think that by writing a book like this or listening to maybe some of the things we've said, that either this book is pro-quarantine or anti-quarantine. I think it's more complicated than that, but it's also more simple in the sense that quarantine is an undeniably good spatial tool for preventing infection. What is interesting is how easily it can be abused. So it's not a question that we need to get rid of quarantine, or that it's something that we should never talk about quarantine again. It's simply a question of making sure that we understand what is happening when quarantine happens, or when quarantine arrives, because I would go out on a limb and say that we are entering the age of quarantine. Diseases are spreading faster than ever. They don't have vaccines. Many families now resist vaccines. And so if everyone at this event at some point in their life experiences quarantine, it wouldn't be entirely surprising. And when it arrives, we should be prepared for it. So I think just we'll leave it at that. And if there are any questions out there, if you're warm enough to ask one, we'd be happy to discuss.
Thank you so much, Geoff and Nicola, for a really fascinating talk. Спасибо большое нашим дорогим гостям за то, что вы до сих пор с нами, несмотря на погоду. У нас есть возможность сейчас задать вопросы, если у вас они есть.
Thank you for being with us in spite of the weather. And if you have questions, you can ask them either in English or in Russian.
У нас есть прекрасный переводчик,
There is a
который
translation.
переведет ваш вопрос для наших гостей. Вот я уже вижу один вопрос.
I see there is one question in the audience. Please give the person the mic.
Thank you for interesting lecture. I think you know that many people in, for example, Japan and other Asian countries every day wearing medical masks. How do you think, is that really effective to prevent flu or other things like that?
Yeah, but I think it really depends on what they're protecting against. I mean, certain basic respiratory flus would be, it's really more shielding other people from you in the case of those masks. And then in other diseases, you might wear the mask as a kind of prophylactic device that makes you feel better, but maybe it's spread in a different way, or it's more virulent and makes it through the cotton filter. So in fact, it's interesting that living in California, which is consumed with wildfire now, as is part of the Russian Arctic, masks go through spikes in the market where you can buy non-medical masks, but the filtration rating is such that you can protect yourself from wildfire. But those kinds of things also would work for very particular respiratory illnesses.
Есть ли какие-то кейсы, которые вас
Are there any cases that inspire you
в области повышения
in the area of
осознанности
raising awareness
в
about the
образовании,
subject of
особенно
quarantine?
So that the kids knew that the father was still available. And so, knowing that your parents haven't disappeared or that you've been locked away. But I think that the lessons that would be applicable for children, I think are, although it's a more emotionally extreme, I think for kids, I think are also relevant for adult participants in quarantine. I mean, it can be extremely disorienting to imagine that, you check into your hotel room and you can't leave again because you've been quarantined, or you're trying to go home to your loved ones in the family and you're not allowed to. But you can see these kinds of things even in the child separation arguments happening in the US right now, where families are being split up for political reasons at the border. How do you prepare children for this kind of radical separation from their parents? And so my point is not that there's an easy solution that we have at all, but it's just that quarantine, once again, though, is a way into like a larger conversation about the general state of parental separation from kids, and also just the whole idea of isolation, even for adults.
And it just made me think of two more things. One, so when we first started researching quarantine, we held a design workshop in New York City at Storefront for Art and Architecture, and one of the participants was a game designer, and he came up with a sort of prototype game that you would play using your phone once a day. And the whole idea was, it was sort of a game that, yes, I do. It was a game that sort of eventually rewarded the kind of cooperation that quarantine demands. So that game doesn't exist, but it was a kind of cool concept towards how you could start having this conversation, involving people, gamify it, but in a way that sort of builds that idea of you're doing something together for the public good, what are the trade-offs, etc. And there is actually a board game called Quarantine as well. So there are some sort of game attempts to bring it to life and sort of bring some of the dynamics to life in a game situation where they can be more easily grasped.
Спасибо за выступление. А можно узнать, был ли в вашей жизни курьезный случай с
Thank you for the presentation. Any maybe joke from life, like CIA or aliens captured you in quarantine, or your mobile phone died and you were in quarantine, something like that. Some funny story, maybe, about you interacting with quarantine or something like that.
I'm not sure how many quarantine jokes along those lines we have, but I mean, it is definitely a field ripe for
quarantine jokes. Yeah. I will say what was funny is when I climbed into that Ebola Trexler Unit in London, the one where you're in the bubble, I was like, oh, can I go in? And the doctor was like, okay. And once I was in there, he mentioned that they had actually only just cleaned it using an experimental, entirely new, untested procedure, and that the person who'd been in there before me had died of Ebola. So that was a quarantine joke on me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the talk. And question that I have is related mostly to the last part that you mentioned, is the situation when the government announced quarantine, or what are the criteria that are to be met to enlist the quarantine. And I guess my question is more related to the cases when probably, because you mentioned that facility in Omaha is designed for 20 people, right?
Yeah.
So what happens if you need to quarantine 200?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's fascinating.
Очень интересный вопрос. Много примеров есть. Один из них, на самом деле, это вот, знаете, многоцелевая архитектура. Это
Japanese earthquake preparedness, where you can almost at the flip of a switch turn a school gymnasium into a medical facility, so that people that are, or for that matter, just a dormitorium. So that people who are made homeless by an earthquake can just go to a gym facility, and now they have a place to sleep. But so we interviewed a healthcare professional that was talking about ways in which architects could help do that kind of thing for sports stadiums, universities, maybe the Strelka courtyard. But the idea would be that you would prepare large-scale architectural structures in advance for housing displaced residents during a quarantine or a pandemic event. And so, I mean, along the lines of, well, this isn't really a joke, but along the lines of the previous comment, there are conspiracy theories, at least in the United States, and I'm sure there are equivalent ones here, that there's a particular U.S. administration called FEMA, which stands for it's the Federal Emergency Management Administration or Agency. But either way, they're in charge of going out to hurricane zones and earthquakes, et cetera, and building what are called tent cities. But there's an ongoing conspiracy theory on both the left and the right wing that FEMA is preparing tent cities and camp cities for everyone, and that they're out there, with their trucks about to build tent cities and house us in them. But those kinds of things I think are really interesting from a quarantine point of view, because those are the types of facilities where we'll have mass quarantine. And I'm not trying to buy into the conspiracy theory here, but I mean, that would be the architectural scenario in which one would experience mass quarantine. You can picture a kind of a military camp. And just imagine everyone, with masks on, trying not to get sick.
I should say that the simulation I went to in DC with the Department of Defense leader and the Department of Homeland Security and so on, at a certain point, U.S. hospitals stopped taking patients in this fictional outbreak, and the Department of Homeland Security didn't know what to do, and was talking about the need to find tents, and the Department of Defense guy was like, well, I have a ton of tents, like, you need tents? And so they arranged a deal where the Defense Department would supply Health and Human Services with tents for all the people who were no longer going to be able to be cared for at the hospital, but had been potentially exposed to the disease. So it was kind of an amazing real-time working out of people who are in government and who lead these departments and had clearly never sort of had this thought process before, figuring out, like, the defense guy was like, oh, I can lend you tents. So it was sort of astonishing to see that decision be made in real time.
Yeah, just one other example too. It came out of another event that we were at, where the question was exactly that. What do we do if we have more than we can house? And so the strategy would be to rent local hotel rooms and just quarantine people inside some random hotel near the airport. But first of all, you can imagine immediately, at least in the American scenario, the hotel bill alone would just be phenomenally huge. And so you'd have to get into either some sort of tax-based reimbursement or a government hotel chain negotiation. But then also imagine that you're staying in that hotel and you wake up the next morning to hear that everyone on the 7th floor is being quarantined for a respiratory disease. You almost by definition would have to be quarantined at that point, because there's not, the air conditioning system is going to be putting the air in their hotel room into your hotel room. So my point is simply that, yeah, that's a very good question, and in an experience of mass quarantine, we'll immediately see the answer to it.
Talking about the games, we have a plugin. Like it simulates the expanding of disease. But the question is about, have you made some inventions about the modern architecture of quarantine, or have you made some imagines of how to recreate the isolation or something like that?
So do you mean contemporary architectural innovations that have made quarantine more precise or more advanced, I guess?
Kind of.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting architecturally in that on one level, there's something fundamental to it that won't change, which is simply that it's about keeping things separate spatially. What's interesting actually is that it's particular types of disease and the way in which they're spread that changes, that requires innovation on an architectural level. Because you might realize that a particular disease sticks around on paint for longer than another disease, in which case you're going to change the coatings on the wall. Or you're going to change the cleaning regime that you use to change to clean the building itself. Or if it's a respiratory thing, you know, Nikki mentioned that that family, everyone had to stay 9 feet apart. You know, it's a relatively arbitrary number. But if you start calculating the distance between how far people need to stay away, and then you start calculating the length of time the disease can survive inside that architectural space, you can kind of start, it's almost like parametric architecture. You can start graphing out how big a room needs to be or how precise the air handling needs to be. And that from that, you can then start calculating a new architecture that is a quarantine architecture and takes into consideration all of these things. And so that's, I'd say that in the abstract, that's what I would say in terms of that.
And I feel, for me, the most interesting is this move to anticipatory quarantine and what kinds of ways, what kinds of virtual barriers might you use to stop people from moving, to stop people from being exposed in the first place. You know, invisible fencing. You know, are people collared and they can't move beyond a certain distance? The Google Nest example. I think that when I think about the future of quarantine, I imagine actually a city that is filled with sort of those kinds of obstacles that can be activated on a personal level based on your social media traces and your demographic and so on. You might never even know you're being quarantined. Your movement is just being sort of restricted.
Какие виды карантина, политические,
What kinds of types of quarantine, psychiatric, economic, political, or others you would highlight? Let me give you a simple example. Smokers, non-smokers, that's quarantine. Laws that prevent people smoking in certain areas is quarantine, technically. So could you give some more examples like this?
Well, yeah, one of the examples we do look at in the book is nuclear waste, for example. So technically, after a certain amount of time, it will become safe, i.e. not dangerous anymore. So you're quarantining it rather than isolating it on some level. And so we do look at that example as a sort of an extreme quarantine scenario.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is interesting about quarantine is how easily it shades off into metaphor. And so, it comes up a lot. We're asked if the Holocaust was an example of quarantine, in the sense that an entire people was spatially isolated, kept in camps. But you start falling down a rabbit hole of the difference between quarantine and isolation. And so, for example, it isn't always quarantine to keep two things separate. Sometimes it is literally just isolation. Other times it's imprisonment. So for example, like if someone is guilty of murder and they're kept in prison for 50 years, are they being quarantined because they're a moral risk and eventually they won't be a moral risk, in which case we can then bring them back into society? Or is that just isolation?
And the element of certainty, I think, is what turns something from quarantine into isolation. So if you are certain, and this is where sort of nuclear waste is this sort of dubious example. But once people who are quarantined, it is that thing of guilty until proven innocent. They are just simply suspected of being a danger rather than known to be a danger. So technically, someone who's been found guilty in a court of law and they're in prison, they are known to be a danger. The certainty is gone if you believe in your justice system.
I mean, unless it's a corrupt legal system. But yeah, I mean, you can find it.
It's a good question, though. I mean, one of the reasons quarantine is so interesting is because of its metaphoric sort of applicability to a lot of other scenarios. You can start looking through that lens and thinking, well, how much of this is suspicion? How much is bias shading this decision? So,
I mean, and to a certain extent, this evades your question, but it also kind of answers it, and it touches a little bit on the previous question. But I think that what's interesting about quarantine too is that you can find examples that could become quarantine in other fields. And so a couple examples of what I mean are if you look at the design of international airports where people first get off a plane from a foreign country and haven't yet passported into the country where they've arrived. They're technically not in that country yet. So at least when you land at Los Angeles Airport, say from Russia, and you have not gone through passport control, you're legally speaking not in the United States. You're just physically on terrain that's in the United States. But so the reason why I mention that is because that architecture of separation and of different circulation that allows two people, I can be in the US and you can still technically speaking be in Russia, but we're looking at one another through glass. That type of architecture and that type of arrangement can become quarantine later if you need to find innovations in design or that kind of thing. But so you can even find this kind of thing. Nikki was hinting at this, but the future of quarantine might be visible now in the warehousing strategies of companies like Amazon.com or Baidu, where you've got these very, very large, or Alibaba, I meant, excuse me, where you've got real-time inventory control that shows exactly where something is, whether or not it's moved. You've got the employees of Amazon, at least, have electronic devices that show exactly where they are in the building. So you can control, who's interacting with who in a different way, and that can become quarantine, or rather, that can be used in a quarantine scenario. And then even in automated ports, there's a really interesting technology that can control the movement of entire landscapes of machines based on whether or not someone is standing in a certain place. And so I realize that steps away from your question, but my point is simply that you can also find interesting examples that aren't quarantine yet, and that you can bring them into the quarantine conversation as a way of talking about quarantine through how it might be constructed in the future, if that makes sense.
Спасибо большое, друзья. Давайте зададим буквально последний вопрос и пойдем все.
Probably last questions, and then let's go get warm.
We can take the last one.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I was wondering if I could ask if in the book you discussed any spatial implications of the ecological necessity to quarantine, basically a state from a state, in order to preserve biodiversity, if you saw any other ramifications of that.
We do. There's a chapter that explicitly looks at animal and plant quarantine and the control of invasive species, and including things like GMOs and plant diseases and any variety of things that might contaminate an otherwise natural landscape. And so, one of the things that comes up there too is that you get really weird technologies emerging in that field, like CRISPR technology and how to stop it. You get invisible fences for mosquitoes in terms of zapping, mosquitoes out of the air, but scaling that up dramatically so that you can actually prevent entire classes of organisms from entering into an ecosystem and keeping that ecosystem pristine. So I think that there's a lot of ecological implications that we discussed, but also technological ones. And then again, all of those things also, come from different fields. This is not in the book, but a totally separate interview that we did many years ago was with an individual who he has this utopian vision of the American West, which is that he wants to eliminate fences. And so his vision is that everything basically west of the Mississippi River will be wide open plains. There will at least in terms of natural land, there'll be no more fences. Ranches will not need to demarcate the edges of their land. And instead, this utopian vision rapidly becomes a kind of cow dystopia, because what he wanted to do was instead affix GPS transponders onto every cow in the American West, but then he could steer them through shocks in their collar by GPS. And so if you have a cow from a certain ranch and it comes up to the edge, there's no fence there, but there's an invisible fence because you're getting shocked in your neck. So it's a relatively terrifying vision, I think, both because it sounds almost like an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. It's like The Running Man, but for cows. but also the unanticipated side effects of that. Like they've noticed that cow behavior is changing at certain times of day because they seem to know when a GPS satellite is within view because they will hide behind certain rocks or trees because they can avoid getting shocked. But in any case, my point very briefly is just simply that those kinds of technologies that are coming from agriculture and coming from landscape management and other fields, once again, have implications for the future of quarantine.
There are a couple of interesting agricultural quarantine spatial anomalies that you might also find interesting. One, for example, a lot of tropical plants have to do their quarantine in colder climates. So if you are shipping, we even have a picture of this. We visited it. If you are shipping a cacao plant for the chocolate trade, the cocoa trade, it has to go and spend its quarantine in a small town called Reading, outside of London in England. And so, here's a tropical plant, but its pests are only dangerous to other tropical plants. And so if you're shipping your cacao plant from Madagascar to South America, it has to go and spend, 6 months in Reading to perform its quarantine. And the coffee one is in the Netherlands, I want to say. The banana one is in Belgium. A lot of these tropical plants have their quarantine stations in cold places because their pests aren't a threat there, which is kind of an interesting sort of spatial anomaly. The other thing that is sort of fascinating about agricultural quarantine is the bee trade. Some of you may know, especially in America, during almond pollination season, for example, almost every single bee in America is trucked to California to pollinate the almonds in the almond orchards. Like there are literally trucks and trucks and trucks and trucks and trucks and trucks of bees coming through the California state border, and they all have to be inspected for diseases. So there's this sort of quarantine season for bees at the California border that we went to see. So there's these weird little kind of anomalies that happen around agricultural quarantine that you would never know about if you didn't dive into it.
Yeah, and I'm sure also if you start picking at the edges of those quarantines, I mean, there's probably very dark imperial reasons why banana quarantine is where it is. So again, if you find a very simple example, like there's a banana plant in Belgium that's under quarantine, and you start picking at that, you can start finding the geography of quarantine, the imperial history of borders. You can find all of these really, really interesting things, including things that we didn't even get into about the origin of the modern passport, which comes from health passports in quarantine. But you can find an unbelievably interesting history hidden in even just things like trying to